right, hello everyone. Welcome back to Sociology of Youth and Religion. That is CHRTC 309. All right, so in this lecture, we are going to be talking about the influence of religious schools. And I mean, on this topic, a bunch of the research has been done on Catholic schools, particularly in the US. So we're going to kind of talk through some of the findings here. All right, so a couple of things to note here about this data. And most of it comes from the National Study of Youth and Religion once again, right? Because this is our best and certainly our most comprehensive source of data. Most of it comes from a book called Young Catholic America, In, Out, and Gone from the Church. Really good book. Again, this one is Christian Smith and Kyle Longest. And I mean, if you're interested in, it's a little out of date now, obviously. I think it came out in about 2014, but still, I think one of the best resources that is around. Okay, so that said, it's interesting, right? A lot of data, probably, one of the few real studies that have looked into, the effects of Christian schooling on kind of long-term faith and all of these sorts of things. So, I mean, I think really, really interesting and important there. That said, like with everything, we do have to keep in mind some differences, right? When we talk about Catholic schools, there is a major difference between Canada and the United States. So in Canada, right, when we talk about the Canadian context, and we talk, we know that we have Catholic schools and often that we have Christian schools. Almost all of these in Canada, to some extent, are publicly funded, right? Even the Christian schools in Edmonton tend to be attached to Edmonton Public Schools and receive at least some of their funding from the provincial government. When we look at the US, the context is very, very different. In the US, Catholic or other religious schools, sometimes referred to as parochial schools, receive no public funding. And often like down to really, really nitpicky sorts of things, right? So like, for example, in the US, you would not even be able to get funding from a city or a town for a playground at your Catholic schools or a Christian school because of what are called Hyde Amendments. And these are basically amendments that were made, they're anti-Catholic amendments at the end of the day, because America actually does have a pretty long and distinguished history of anti-Catholicism. So they basically, a bunch of states passed what are called Hyde Amendments that made it impossible for parochial schools to get any kind of state funding at all, right? And this is basically because they wanted them all to run out of money and close down so that everybody would be forced to attend public schools, which were very much Protestant and now are very much secular. And in most places, these laws remain in place so that, parochial schools cannot receive any kind of state funding. So in the U.S., right, and I mean, this is kind of supported by the separation of church and state in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, although technically that would only apply, if we're talking strict American legal terms, that would only apply to the federal government. State governments, in fact, can do whatever they want with regards to church and state. They don't have to be separate in the same way as the federal government does. At least that's my understanding of the Constitution. I'm not a constitutional scholar by any stretch. Okay, so when we have parochial schools or religious schools in the United States, generally speaking, they are funded entirely out of the tuition that parents pay for their children to attend those schools. So if you're going to send your child to a religious school in the U.S., you are making a choice, and often a difficult one, and one that involves a significant amount of financial sacrifice. Right, in Canada, we still have 3 provinces with publicly funded Catholic schools. Quebec used to have them, as did Newfoundland. Both of those have now gotten rid of them. But Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario still have publicly funded Catholic schools. Now, of course, that makes it much less significant when you choose to send your kid to a Catholic school because you're not paying for it, right? So you're not so much making a very distinct choice. Okay, so if we remember, when we talked about Peter Berger at the beginning of the class and this idea of plausibility structures and the sacred canopy, right? Peter Berger says the reality of the Christian world depends upon the presence of social structures with which this reality is taken for granted and within successive generations of individuals, within which successive generations of individuals are socialized in such a way that this world will be real to them, right? So what Berger's basically saying there, again, in his book on the sacred canopy, is that, Christianity, like any kind of reality system, is ultimately supported by a whole bunch of institutions, right? By an institutional context, which makes it real to people. Okay, so we can think of religious schools in this kind of way, right? These are a kind of social structure where the plausibility structures of religion should, if they are working properly, I'm being a bit of a functionalist here, are formed and maintained from generation to generation, right? So that should be their social function. And I mean, according to this study, 2004, so this is out of the very, very first wave of the National Study of Youth and Religion, Rigneris, Smith, and Smith, higher religiosity amongst schoolmates is ultimately linked to more frequent church attendance, higher religious salience, and religious transformation in adolescence. So, not surprisingly, the more religious people you are around in your formative years, shock of shocks, the more religious you're probably going to be, right? So, and you're more likely, to attend church more. You think religion's more important, and religious transformations, right? The potentiality, right? Like I talk about, people having religious potential. If you're around more religious people, that religious potential is easier to access. So we see more religious transformation in adolescence. Okay, so what might be some of the possible mechanisms that might lead young people who attend Catholic schools to be more religious, or Christian schools or religious schools of some kind? Okay, so we can theorize, right, that attendance at religious schools might situate adolescents in more religious friendship networks, right? Certainly, we talked about in great detail the role of parents. Peers matter as well, right? And moving into those adolescent and emerging adult years, as people, don't get rid of their parents, right? It's not like people completely don't care what their parents think. Parents are still very, very important, as I think we've established. But friends do become really important in those adolescent years, right? And that secondary socialization of peers, I think, makes a big difference. It's quite interesting and quite important, I think. Okay, so if you have more religious friends, that might lead to more religiosity, right? No guarantees there, but it's a theory. All right. The effects of homophilous friendship networks might exert a protective effect into emerging adulthood. All right. So think about this in terms of one of Berger's kind of thoughts when we talk about plausibility structures and the breakdown of the sacred canopy according to him, and secularization in general. So one of the things that Berger sort of talked about, right, was pluralism, right? That pluralism as an aspect of modernity probably exerts a sort of negative pressure on religion in lots of interesting and important ways, right? The more ideas you're exposed to and the more competing ideas that are around, the harder ultimately religious systems are going to have to work, right? I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? If all you have is a single religious kind of worldview or a single worldview without a lot of competition, ultimately that religious system is not going to have to work as hard, right, to convince people and to get them on side, right? So if your friendship networks are composed mostly of, say, Catholics or Christians or Muslims or Hindus, right, ultimately that religious system doesn't have to work quite as hard to convince you, right? Or to seem plausible, because it's like everybody sort of agrees at the end of the day that this is how things work. Now, let's say you went to a public school instead, right? And you have, your Muslim friend, your Hindu friend, your Catholic friend, your Christian friend, your atheist friend, your agnostic friend, your nun friend, right? All of these different friend groups or friends from different kind of traditions and kind of belief systems. Because it's not homophilous, right? So unified in its sort of ideology, you're going to be aware of many more ways of thinking, many more ways of doing. It doesn't, I think you don't need to be religious to be a good person or whatever, however this happens to be sort of articulated. And so it doesn't have to work, it's going to have to work a lot harder. Your religious system is going to have to work a heck of a lot harder, almost a bad word, a heck of a lot harder, in order to seem compelling and convincing, right? And especially, right, again, pitched against a culture that isn't always particularly friendly to religious ideas, right? So if you have a homophilous friend group that's all religious and all sort of believes the same thing, there's a better chance probably that you're going to develop, through those kind of key moments of adolescence and maybe emerging adulthood, with people who sort of agree with you, and therefore that ideological system is much more protected, right? It doesn't have to contend with as many negative voices and as many voices that are saying maybe this isn't true. Okay, next kind of mechanism. Religious schools might provide role models for students in the form of teachers, coaches, and other staff members. Okay, I mean, this is important, right? One of the things that I think is maybe a little bit under researched and something that needs, some contextualization is the role of other adults, right? When it comes to the formation of religion or irreligion in emerging adults. Religious schools theoretically provide this, right? If you've got role models, teachers you like, coaches you like, other staff members you like who are religious, right? Outside of your parents, right? People who can mentor you, people who can be kind of touch points that, emerging adults really need. And I'll say, it's not something that I cover as much in this course, but when it comes to sociology of youth, SOS 377, mentorship and connections with adults, even into those emerging adult years, right? Even into your 20s, connections with those kinds of mentors is extremely important for young people. Extremely important, right? The more of them they have, the more likely they are to be thriving, right? To be, and to take fewer risks, make better life choices. Life outcomes, much better for those who have more adults that they're sort of linked into. We'll talk about why this is, when we talk about life outcomes a little bit later in the course. But, religious school might offer more of these people who are themselves religious, right? Who believe the same things and offer another adult, another caring adult who, emulates, who models, who shows people what it means to live a kind of life where religious faith is important. So young people may choose to emulate these role models when they're out on their own, right? People who they respect who aren't their parents. And this is social learning theory, an idea taken from social learning theory, that people emulate those people who are around them, and especially those people they like and want to bring, their behavior into alignment with. Typically, given a greater degree of religious education, right? Okay, so this is the stocks of knowledge argument, right? When it comes to, say, looking at Steve Bruce, right? So one of Steve Bruce's arguments, if you recall, I told you these things were going to be important. I was going to come back to them all along through the course. So Steve Bruce's argument about secularization, right? Late secularization, he talks about declining stocks of knowledge, right? The fact that in society, there's just less religious knowledge around, and that leads to secularization. So theoretically, right, if you went to a religious school, you'll have at least some greater degree of religious education that could shape your life choices later on in life, right? Again, there's no guarantees in life. What did John Wayne say? If you want a guarantee, buy a toaster. There's no guarantees, but chances are you'll have at least some kind of religious basics, more religious knowledge, which might shape your religious choices later in life. As opposed to, say, no knowledge, right? If people know nothing about religion, obviously that choosing a religious system is going to take a much greater sort of, I don't want to say a leap of faith, but it's a much harder sell, right? Because religious systems are peculiar, right? They have peculiar beliefs in a lot of cases. I don't want to say any of these things are wrong, but from the outside, a lot of religious beliefs may seem very, very odd, right? And so if you're acculturated to them as a young person, I think a much greater chance that you would remain in that and find them less off-putting than if you have no religious education. Just think of like Catholic claims, right? If you came into Catholicism totally blind, without any kind of knowledge, right? What would you encounter? Well, you would encounter a group of people that, at least ostensibly, though in lived reality, I don't know how much this is the case, but at least ostensibly, I only say this because there's been lots of surveys that say that Catholics neither understand nor believe this particular set of beliefs, but it is a core belief of Roman Catholicism that during the Mass, right, after the prayer of consecration, the host or the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Jesus, right? That they are not just a symbolic representation of that, but they are in fact in some way, without changing their appearance, right? So they still look and taste and feel like bread and wine. Without changing their appearance, they actually do become, in reality, the body and blood of Jesus. Okay, now, for Catholics, this is sort of uncontroversial. This is, something that should be well understood because it's deeply established in Catholic theology. From the outside, that probably appears a little kooky, right? Because it's just an interesting, deeply theological, ancient belief that from the outside probably appears slightly nuts, right? Because there's no context to understand what that is. And that context has to be built. That context of belief has to be built. Without it, right, that wouldn't make any sense. And you can look at any religious system, right? And you would find similar things, right? That, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his last prophet, right? Again, from the outside, what context would make sense of that particular claim? For Muslims, it's self-evident, right? And if you've been raised as a Muslim, that would be fairly self-evident. But, for someone coming from the outside, it would be like, why? Why is that self-evident? Why should I believe that this one person, living in Arabia all these centuries ago, was the last prophet of God, right? Why should I think that? Why, it makes sense if you're internal. So, and obviously, there's a lot of Muslim theology that goes into supporting that belief, supporting, and historical facts and all of these sorts of things. But without that context, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. I mean, you could do this for the Mormons, right? These ancient South Americans are actually Hebrews who sailed across the ocean and settled in Latin America. And that Jesus, after he was done, with the crucifixion and the ascension and all those things, traveled to the Americas to spread the good news to indigenous people in the Americas who were actually Jews, a lost tribe of the Jews. Or that, I don't want to butcher Mormon theology too much, but that, God has a body and that, you will be elevated once, if you're a good Mormon and you do all the good Mormon-y things, elevated to the status of a God, and then you and your that will populate other planets, right? And on and on. I mean, sounds odd from the outside. because you don't understand why that system of thought is in place. Internally, though, it makes perfect sense if you've been educated in it. So if you get that education when you're young and you understand the system of belief of, say, Christianity or Mormonism or Islam, Catholicism, which is Christianity, but a particular form of Christianity, right? Those are going to make sense. So that religious education may shape your life choices or your religious choices later in life. Why? A, because you already understand that system, right? So you're more likely to stay in it. B, because you have that base of knowledge from which you can then make a choice about this, right? You don't have to start from scratch and be like, well, what religion should I choose? Well, let's look at Buddhism. Okay, let's deep dive into the teaching. That is an exhausting process that frankly most people ain't got time for. And so we don't see that happening a lot. And I think this is probably why, if people aren't religiously socialized in adulthood, picking a religion is going to be very uncommon, right? Because now we have access to so much knowledge about religious systems. And most people simply do not have the time as adults to do like a deep search for meaning, right? A deep search for what religious system. I mean, adulthood is busy, right? I mean, adolescents and emerging adulthood are busy too. And unless there's that punctual event or that punctiliar event, like that Berger kind of talks about, right? When he talks about, nightmares and dreams that linger into waking and death or transcendent kind of moments, unless there's one of those. And I mean, that's a pretty weak to count on that. You're not going to get, people jumping into religion unless they have a sort of base of knowledge to go from. And I think it makes sense what Steve Bruce says, right? As that base of knowledge erodes, fewer and fewer people are going to jump in. And I don't, again, think that this is necessarily because people are like anti-religious. I think people just don't have time, right, to consider religious answers. They're going to take from the culture that's around them and that they understand. And I think that's mostly what we see happening. I've lingered on this slide far too long. But I think it's interesting, right, that religious education might shape religious choices later in life. I think is a good theory, again, because it's providing that basic level of knowledge. Okay, so so this might not apply as much to Alberta, given some aspects of our public school system, right? The fact that curriculum largely is set by the state, right, by the provincial government of Alberta. Some of it may, though. And I will certainly say, knowing the Catholic school system in Alberta quite well, having, attended Catholic school, and, my wife is a Catholic school teacher. I've worked with Edmonton Catholic schools on a few projects. And so I understand sort of, my mom was a Catholic school teacher too, right? So I've been, interacting with the Catholic schools in Alberta for a very, very, very long time. And I've sort of seen some of the shifts. And I will say of the Catholic school system in Alberta, in the past probably like 20 years, they've really leaned into Catholic identity, right? Catholicity and permeation of faith through the curriculum is a major value that the board emphasizes, and for them it should be everywhere. So, I'll say not everything here applies and not everything here is the same, but I'll just tell you what some of the research findings were. And some of them might apply to Catholic schools in Alberta, some of them might not. Okay, so Jeremy Wecker, in his 2008 piece, theorizes that Catholic schools may not have as great an effect on students as they were once thought to because of a shift in focus. And he cites this study by Baker, Hahn, and Brauman from 1996, suggesting that less than half of Catholic secondary schools list religious development as a primary goal. Now, this kind of makes sense, right? As society has gotten a little bit more secular, and because these schools are deeply dependent on people basically paying to send their children to them. Now, a lot of Catholic schools in the US have been kind of clustered in the Midwest and the Northeast, right? So places like Boston, Detroit, Pittsburgh, New York City, right? The big, like Philadelphia, right? All the big East Coast cities. Um, those places now are much more secular than they used to be, right? They used to be, especially somewhere like Boston, populated by a ton of Catholics, right? A very Catholic city. That's changed probably in the last couple decades, or it's much more secular now, and the whole Northeast has sort of secularized in major ways. Um, and so to attract students, right? If you're going to attract students, if you're going to keep these institutions alive, in the past where maybe people cared about Catholic identity, then it would have been a natural sell to put religious development. When people stop caring as much, right, as we secularize a bit, um, what else is the sell? What's the selling point of your school, right? So a lot of Catholic schools have shifted towards academics, right? They become kind of preppy Catholic schools, or preparatory schools for elite colleges. It's like, we have great academics, right? And again, not surprising at all. None of this should shock you. They've moved, a lot of Catholic schools have sort of moved the emphasis onto something else that's a better marketing tool for them. Okay, so Wecker, in his 2008 piece on Protestant and Catholic schools, basically said that Catholic school adolescents are more likely to report attending religious services than their public school counterparts and report higher religious salience. So that, is generally, I think, a point in favor of Catholic schools, right? They attend more religious services than their public school counterparts, and they report higher religious salience, right? So they say religion is more important to them. Okay, kind of a win. Their people are less likely to attend youth group or religious education classes. Religious education classes is kind of makes sense, right? These are probably people who were raised in Roman Catholicism, so they don't need to go to additional religious education classes, or probably don't feel like they do. They probably could benefit if they want to learn more about Catholicism, but most of them are probably pretty happy with what they know. And attending youth group than their public school peers. Now, this may just be a function of Catholics not doing this particular aspect of kind of parachurch activity particularly well. This has been a long struggle, I think, though I don't have any data on it. But anecdotally, I can say that, youth groups in Catholic churches have been a struggle for lots of different reasons. It's not something that the Catholic Church seems to do especially well. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, I certainly know that there's been groups like Life Teen that have come around and tried to, revolutionize this and make Mass a little bit more fun and make your youth group a little bit more fun and have a kind of a curriculum. I don't know how successful those have been, and I haven't seen any research on it that's particularly recent. But, anecdotally, from my very Catholic friends who have teenagers, it's not something that I think gets a lot of compliments. So it may just be something Catholics don't do very well, and maybe not much of an emphasis put on it. Certainly, like the percentage of even Catholic parishes that have a quote unquote youth minister has tended to be quite low, right? Protestant churches, and you're probably going to find a lot of Protestants, especially in the U.S., in public schools, especially evangelicals, right? So our very conservative Protestants might be more likely to attend religious youth groups, right? Because it's more emphasized in a lot of Protestant churches. The two groups, right, spend about the same amount of time reading scripture and praying privately. That is nearly zero. Not much, if we can put it that way. They don't spend a ton of time reading scripture, right? Teenagers, for whatever reason, not that interested in the Bible for the most part. Actually, at this point, anecdotally, getting teenagers to read much of anything is quite the heavy lift. So, not surprising that these numbers are what they are. Okay, so Baker, Hahn, and Brauman's 1996 study, which Wecker cites, says that more than 2/3 of Protestant schools are overwhelmingly committed to the religious development of their students. So again, there's probably some sort of regional differences here when we talk about the U.S. that we have to kind of be attendant to. Evangelical schools and the evangelical population is more likely to be, say, in the Bible Belt and outside of the Northwest. The Northeast and kind of Pacific Coast, right? The biggest communities are kind of in the middle and south, right? South, kind of southwest, and a little bit in, say, Florida Southeast, right? But places like Texas, very, very religious, and Alabama, Mississippi. So you see more evangelical schools in these places, right? Now, they're younger, right, in terms of the kind of history of these institutions. They tend not to be places with as long of a track record, right? They've come into existence relatively recently. So they don't have the long history of, say, parochial schools or parish schools that are attached to churches that used to be run by nuns and priests and now are run by professional teachers, right? Now these are just schools that have been sort of recently founded for the most part. So what did Baker, Hand, and Brauman's study find? Evangelicals contribute to better biblical literacy, right? So they were more committed to their religious identities, and they do contribute to better biblical literacy, right? They spend more time reading, thinking about the Bible. But, here's the big but, did not fundamentally alter worldview. So students who went to evangelical secondary schools, so evangelical high schools, were similar to their peers in overall worldview. Okay, so what does this mean? Why? Well, I think this probably speaks to the very powerful role of the culture, right? Culturally, evangelicals, might know more about the Bible, but ultimately, the surrounding culture probably plays an incredibly big role in their shaping. I don't think this should surprise anybody. I think this is pretty commonsensical or common-sensy at the end of the day. I don't think anybody should be surprised by this, right? The culture has a very, very powerful effect, right? Taylor Swift might be more powerful than the Pope. Hey, I should title a academic paper that Taylor Swift might be more powerful than the Pope. But Taylor Swift might be more powerful than the Pope. The draw of that kind of secular culture is a very powerful one. Okay. Evangelical secondary school, their worldview is relatively the same. And we've seen, I don't think I have any slides for it in the course, maybe something to add in the future. Attitudes on things like gay marriage, or same-sex marriage rather, LGBTQ inclusion, and these sorts of things are all shifting in young evangelicals as well, right? As they kind of are pulled along by the culture in major ways. So another study, so this one, Wecker, so we're going back to Wecker here, found that young Protestants no more likely than public schoolers to attend religious services, right? So they're just as likely to attend religious services, but they report higher religious salience and time spent reading scripture and praying in private, right? So more religious, but no more likely to attend religious services. So, that's a little bit of a contradiction. I think probably, they are in families that are more religious in that sense, right? Evangelicals tend to rate their religious salience to some extent fairly high, although we are seeing increasing amounts of secular evangelicals in a sense. It's like evangelicals who identify with the label but aren't particularly religious, which is a confusing set of data, but something for another time. So more religious salience, again, that my religion is very important to me, and time spent reading scripture and praying in private. Now, I suppose these are probably really important Protestant values, right? We have from our friend Martin Luther, that's my best German accent, Martin Luther, this idea of sola scriptura, and that people should be interacting with the Bible on a personal level, right? That they shouldn't be leaving it to clergy. So I think that makes sense, right? More time spent reading scripture and praying in private, is going to be a very evangelical kind of Protestant thing. Okay, so kind of results from Wecker's study, which again was taken out of some of the early data from the National Study of Youth and Religion. Catholic schoolers, not more religious than secular schoolers on any religious outcome once you control for parental religiosity. So they are about as religious as their parents are. So if you control for parental religiosity, they're not any more religious than anyone else. They're less likely to attend they're less likely than secular schoolers to attend external religious events, right? Bible class, singing in a choir, etc., youth group, all those things. Protestant schoolers are more religious than secular schoolers on every measure after controlling for parental religiosity. Okay, so Protestant schoolers are more, right? More like over twice as likely to attend religious services as adults, more likely to participate in secondary religious activities, right? So youth groups and things like that. Like I said, much more emphasized in Protestantism, and also more likely to value their religious faith. Wecker's conclusion is Protestant schools appear to be better agents of religious socialization, at least in part because they foster a religious environment, right? So they talk about religion more, right? Whereas Catholic schools have drifted a little bit into this kind of like we're private schools with a cross, in the US at least. Protestant schools appear to be successful agents of religious socialization because they foster a religious environment. They allow parents to put children in a religious environment, right? So, right, they allow you to put your kids in that environment. And they channel Protestant youth towards religious post-secondary environments. Interesting. So, this one I know is true, and even kind of anecdotally, right? We have a religious Protestant university in Edmonton called King's University, or the King's University, rather, is the proper title. So, I know this anecdotally from years of talking with students who've come through my classes, who've been through Protestant schools, right? In Edmonton, Millwoods Christian, and the one in the West End, I can't remember which one it is. And there's a strong pressure, amongst people who attend these schools often to send their kids to King's, despite the elevated cost. Why? Because they want to maintain their young people in a religious environment as much as possible, right? Now in the US, we have this similar kind of effect, right? There are schools like Baylor, like Hillsdale. There's a ton of them, and I can't remember them all off the top of my head. Lots of, very, I guess Liberty at the outside. The Liberty kind of sucks, and I don't want to talk about it. It is the biggest evangelical university, and I think it's also kind of a scam. But anyway, my opinion on Liberty is not important. A lot of evangelical parents will push their kids towards these post-secondary environments, which again sort of delays, in some senses, their encounter with the secular world. This has that, homophilous effect and therefore protective effect on religiosity. In a sense, the instinct for religious parents is that, especially these Protestant ones, is probably the correct one. That the longer you can keep them in that homophilous kind of environment, the more they are bonded with people who share their basic views, right? The more likely they are to find a romantic partner that shares their basic worldview, the more likely they are in a secular society or in a post-Christian society to remain religious, right? So when we see, the Edmonton Muslim academies and Hindu academies and, Christian schools and Christian universities, they probably offer some kind of protective effect in just delaying that encounter with that pluralistic secular world for a little bit longer into those few years of emerging adulthood. Now again, like the culture's powerful, right? The culture's powerful. And it's not like everybody who attends a religious school ends up super religious. That's not the claim, and that wouldn't make any sense, and I would never say it because it's silly. But it probably, in at least some cases, delays things enough that it protects that religiosity a little bit. Okay, so some data from the kind of Catholic side on National Study of Youth and Religion. Again, this is taken from Smith and Longest's book, Young Catholic America, In, Out, and Gone from the Church. Really good book if you're interested in Roman Catholicism. in the US, obviously. But even I think for the Catholic context in Canada, it's a really fascinating piece of work. Okay, so basically, those who attend Catholic schools as teenagers don't seem to experience any protective effect into emerging adulthood, right? So Catholic schools, as opposed to these Protestant schools, don't seem to protect the faith of their young people in the same way. So Catholics, and there's a lot of kind of data on Catholics, experience average or above average drops in religiosity into emerging adulthood. So they're very much like, pretty much the culture. But they are still much less likely than Catholic teens who never attended Catholic schools to say they never attend Mass and never pray. Okay, so this is kind of interesting, and I do find this interesting. Again, this context, I think, kind of matters. Those who went to Catholic schools are probably still having drops in religiosity. But they might not be becoming nuns. More likely, than Catholic teens who never attended Catholic schools to say they never attend Mass and never pray. So they're probably still maintaining some degree of Catholic identity. Now, again, I think this kind of matters if you're Catholic, obviously, and if you care about religion. And why? Well, because they are going to instill some degree of religious knowledge. And they're sort of protective to some extent of that Catholic religious potential, right? So if you say you never attend Mass and never pray, in a lot of ways that religious potential, well, it's still there, I think, is probably more closer to being extinguished than if you attend Mass occasionally and pray occasionally. So you still have that potentiality, right? You have the stock of knowledge and you have that religious potential that's waiting to be activated. All it needs is a spark, right? All it needs is, I don't know, a great YouTube video from Bishop Barron, or the death of someone you care about to kind of get you questioning and get you thinking about faith again in some way, right? That's all it really takes. And again, not to say that any of those things in all cases work, but if you're still kind of attending occasionally, that potentiality I think is much more likely to still be active. So, if Smith and Longest are correct, the Catholic schools seem to stop Catholic emerging adults from entirely abandoning religious practice. When moving to emerging adulthood, that protects that potentiality. So that potentiality remains. So even though Catholic schools seem to do a pretty cruddy job of instilling religious identity, of things like biblical literacy, for those who are Catholic, it seems to preserve something, right? All right, so this is like the best illustrative quote, and I think this is really interesting, right? Our results suggest, however, that what may have once been mandatory rather than voluntary, Mass attendance, sticks. In some ways, even when young people have left the institutional requirement behind. So, right, once you leave the Catholic school and you were attending Mass for Catholic school, in some ways that sticks. Emerging adults who attended Catholic high school clearly do not attend Mass very frequently. No kidding. But the vast majority still attend at least occasionally. So it's sticky, and again, it protects that religious potentiality. Okay, so Smith et al. Found that attending Catholic school, one of the strongest predictors of increase in religiosity in teenagers, not among the most religious in terms of participation and salience. Okay, so if you take out the most religious peers, like the most religious teenagers, right? And you take sort of the middle and lower group, right, in terms of their religious salience, how important they say religion is and how much they participate. Only 1 in 10 Catholic teens who didn't go to Catholic school experienced an increase in religiosity. Interesting. 1 in 4 who went to Catholic schools said they did. So, again, I think this speaks to possibly the role that Catholic schools play in conserving that religious potential. I think that's important, right? I think that's really, really interesting. Is, 1 out of 10 Catholic teens who didn't go to Catholic school experienced an increase in religiosity. 1 in 4 who went did. That means in some way that religious potentiality is better protected in that environment, right? It's generating people who have more religious potentiality that can then be activated by something else. So Catholic schools, well, they're not good at many things. I think they might be good at that based on this data from the National Study of Youth and Religion, right? They might be good at least holding people in a place where they could become more religious, right? So for all their institutional failings, and trust me, there are many, they're okay at that. And I think if you're an advocate for, say, Catholic schools in either America or in Canada, that probably matters, right? that, Catholics do lose a lot of people, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. As we go into my little excursus on science and religion, which again comes from Smith. But preserving that religious potential, even if, your Catholic school ultimately isn't perfect, that probably matters if you're a religious person, right? If you're a Roman Catholic, keeping that possibility that someone might become religious later, I think probably is really important. All right, so let's take a quick look. This is right out of Smith and Longest's book. Basically, 4 paths to highest emerging adult service, attendance, importance of faith, and personal prayer. So there's 4 kind of paths that they identified that can lead to this, right? So high parental religious service attendance and importance of faith, right? Okay, we've been talking a lot about that. That kind of makes sense. Plus high teen importance of religious faith. Plus a teen that has many adults in religious congregation to turn to for help and support, right? So that is one pathway, right? So very religious, and lots of people, kind of that supporting infrastructure. Okay, path 2. High teen importance of religious faith. So the teenager cares about religious faith. Parents may not here, right? Teen has many adults in religious congregation to turn to for help and support. So they can turn to lots of people for help and support, right? They have a very supportive community. So when they run into trouble, right, they run into questions they can't answer, they know who to turn to, right? And that I think makes sense. Teen frequently reads scripture, right? So someone who's very engaged and is reading religious texts a lot. All right. Path 3. Teen did attend a Catholic high school, plus high importance of religious faith for the teenager, but low parental religious service attendance and importance of faith. Plus, a teen has few adults in religious congregation to turn to help support. This can lead into, highest emergent. Now, so you have 2 factors here that I think are probably kind of working against this person, but because they attended a Catholic high school and they have a high importance of religious faith, they go into that. Okay. And then the last path, right, path 4, teens did not attend a Catholic high school, but they have a high importance of religious faith and high parental religious service attendance. Teen does not frequently read scripture, so Bible reading apparently not always necessary, but you have to have these other supporting kind of infrastructures, right? Parents being probably the most important, and that high importance of religious faith being passed on. And 5 years later, right, high religious service attendance. So, all right, all of this to say, there's a few different ways. If they did attend a Catholic school, it can be influential, but it's not necessary, right? There's a lot of other paths to high emerging adult service attendance. So, all right, enough said about Catholic schools, I think. But definitely, I think interesting to think that the role they play is probably not as big as we might think, right? And certainly not as big as the advocates of religious schools probably hope. But seems to preserve that potentiality. And I think that's the most important thing. That's probably what you should take away from all of this.